Next, we will look into black box testing. In black box testing, we are looking at the inputs and the outputs of the software. In black box testing, we have no view to the internals of the software. This is different from white box testing that mainly looks at the internals of the software. Knowledge sources of black box testing are typically requirements documents, other specifications, domain knowledge, and analysis of past defect data. The methods used in black box testing are equivalence class partitioning, boundary value analysis that we will study during these lectures. Then there are also state transition testing, cause effect graphing, and error guessing. Let's look into equivalence class partitioning, also known as category partitioning. Here we divide or partition the input in areas which are the same. In other words, they are equivalent. In the screen you can see an oval shape that is partitioned into 3 classes. Inside of each class, the items appear to be the same. So we have 4 equivalence classes. One with brownish dots, blue rectangles, and orange rectangles. You should notice that this is not only the inputs that we can partition, but one can consider the outputs, system states, data, and so on. Inside one partition, the behavior of the system is assumed to be identical, just like these identical pieces inside this figure. The core assumption of this testing technique is that if one value works, all will work. So, it is better to have one from each partition than all from one. So in other words, it's better to have one brown, one blue rectangle, and one orange, rather than to have all from a particular class, like for example the blue circles. Looking at from a practical perspective, we could consider values from 1 to 12. Now this would represent the month in a calendar system. So we could say that we have valid numbers which are 1 to 12, and then we have invalids that are larger than 12 or smaller than 1. Boundary value analysis extends the equivalence class partitioning by focusing on the boundaries. The idea is that the faults tend to lurk near the boundaries. For example, in the figure, we can see that the boundary is drawn here, but we can also see that there are blue dots that is on the right of the boundary, and there is a yellow triangle that is on the left side of the boundary. So these could be considered the failure cases if this were to be the software to be tested. So looking at the calendar month example again, we would test the boundaries between the valid and the invalid. So we would test the invalid case of 0, we would test the valid case of 1, then we would test the valid case of 12 and the invalid case of 13. Let's look into an example of applying boundary values and equivalence classes with Outlook calendar date field testing. So we have already established that for the month, the valid numbers are from 1 to 12, and the boundaries would then be 0 and 1 and 12 and 13. let's start the testing. So we make a new calendar entry. We give it some title. Let's just write in title. And now we start testing the month field. So we enter the values numerically. So we can see we test first the valid case of 1. So this should work. And it does. It says that the event was created. Okay, so 1 worked. Now we test whether we can enter 0. So let's give it a title 0. And now we put in here 6th day of the 0th month. Let's see what happens. Nope, it fixed it to 1. That is interesting. So as you noticed, it didn't give an error message of trying to enter invalid month. Instead, it took the 0 month and changed it to 1. I do have to say that that behavior was unexpected. I was expecting for error message, but I didn't get one. Regardless, we cannot really call this a bug. It appears to be working well to some degree. It does something that the user might not actually expect. But on the other hand, I don't know what the user is expecting when they enter the month 0. So, okay, let's move on to the next case. Next test case is trying to enter the month 12. So we give it a title, and this is 12, and now we put it to 6th day of December 21. Oops, not 12. And let's see what happens. What? Okay. It opened the calendar field. Here. I find 12 and press save. Okay, it said it was created, and now we go and check. Should find, the January, December, which is jouluku in Finnish, and it is here. We can confirm that this works. In the final test case, we try to test value 13 as the month. Given the unexpected behavior, what happened with the 0, I'm also expecting here that it would, instead of 13, it would fix it to 12. I would place the highest probability on that. And then there is another chance that it actually places it on the January of next year. But that would be really strange. So let's see what happens. Okay, so now we try to enter 13. So we give this title 13. And we try to fix the month to be 13. Okay, now we have 13 and we press save. Wow. So the month field seems to be working. The behavior of 0 and 13 was somewhat unexpected, but I still would not call this a bug. I mean, it works correctly enough. Let's start testing the day. We can already see that things start to get a bit more complicated here. So whereas in the month we had the valid that was between 1 and 12, we can see that for the day value, we have valid that it is between 1 and 31, depending on the month. So in some months you have 31 days, in others you have 30, and finally in February you have 28. Does this look like a valid or correct range for the valued values of the month to you? Think about this for a while. Have I been missing something? at this point, some of you have already figured out what is missing. Obviously, the thing that is missing is that February can have a valid range from 1 to 29 during leap years. Okay, so from the valid range, it is quite easy to build the boundaries. So for months with 31 days, the boundaries would be 0 and 1 and 31 and 32. Let's now continue testing the Office Outlook calendar software. So I'm in the January month here. It has 31 days, so the boundaries would be 0 and 1 and 31 and 32. Okay, so title, what happens if we try to enter 0 of January? I would assume that it becomes 1st of January based on the behavior that the month worked. Let's see what happens. Okay, so we put in 0. No, it becomes the 5th. So, right. Okay, now I think I have to conduct an extra test, because when we enter the 0, became the 5th, and 5th is the date I have been entering this event to, but then I have manually inserted the 0. So what happens if I try to do 6th from the 5th? Does this also return this to the 5th? Now that would be really strange. This would probably be a bug. Now we should go to the 6th. Let's see what happens. It does indeed go to the 5th, or to the 6th, excuse me. So it seems that when you try to enter invalid date, it looks at the day that you have currently opened, and then it selects that day. So following that, if I try to enter title and I say 32, now this should be also on the 5th. Okay, 32, and this should now become to the 5th. If this software makes any sense. And it does. So we are still missing the test cases for the valid side of January, that is the 1st of January and 31st. Let's conduct these valid tests quickly. And so title first, and this should go to the 1st. See if it's the case. Title 1, yes, it is there. And now we do the 32. 31. And this should go to the 31st of January. Let's see if it's there. And it works. Okay, now we have validated that January month with 31 days works correctly. Now the assumption would be that March, May, July, August and December also work in similar fashion. Now one should continue testing with months that have 30 days, months that have 28 days, and months during leap years in February. And the leap year testing is actually quite tricky, as you can see. If a year is not divisible by 4, then it is a common year. But then there are these extra rules, you know, divisible by 25, it is a leap year, not divisible by 16, it's a common year. So this would actually require much more testing to cover this correctly. However, to keep this video in reasonable length, we will not test the month any further, but we will jump to the year. Okay, so what would be valid assumptions for the year? I mean, in an ideal case, valid range should be any integer. You should basically be allowed to enter anything there. However, I think there are restrictions. Also from the valid range, there should be basically no boundaries. As long as you enter an integer, it should work. However, how this actually works, I have no idea. Let's just see what comes up in our test. Let's start out by entering a year that is somewhere along far away in the history, like 1899. Let's see what happens. Work. 1899. Okay. Now we try to save it. Okay. That it worked. Okay, now I'm trying to check it. Okay, great. As far as I can tell, there is no way to enter a number in here, so I have to do this manually. A bit annoying. Okay, now we have arrived. Now we have arrived to the January of 1899. It should be on the 5th, I think. Okay, it seems to be working. Fair enough. Delete this historical event from my calendar. Now if I test any value that's even smaller, then I have to still manually click that date. So checking whether this actually works is going to be highly annoying. Okay, I'm just going to assume that if I enter something and if I say, if the Outlook claims that the event was created, then I accept that as an answer and I will not go back to checking some prehistorical dates. Okay, let's try something prehistorical. You know, our calendar is based on the year the Christ was born, supposedly. So if we do negative -1, that should still be a valid case. If this thing works, I will be very, very surprised. Okay, entering -1, so this would be the year before the Christ was born, 4th of January. Cannot work, but let's see what happens. Now we got an exception. Create calendar failed, Microsoft Exchange Services common error invalid value. Okay, so finally I'm able to get an invalid value from here. I was actually surprised that now there is actually an error message that comes to the screen. This probably shouldn't happen, but there should be like a dialog saying that you cannot do it, because it is showing the actual error message to the user. Okay, continuing along the same lines, let's put in 0 for the year and see what happens. I think we get the same error message, but as I haven't tried this, we will see. So it's the 4th of January in year 0. Some people claim that there is actually no year 0, but let's see what Outlook thinks. Oh, Outlook thinks there is a year 0. It says that the event was created. Right? Okay, now I have an event on the 4th of January in year 0, and I'm not going to click back all the way there to delete this event. If some of you figure out the way to delete this event without clicking here, 1900 times, send me a message. Okay, now we have done some testing, so let's document our results regarding the year. So we have to change this. We claim that valid would be any integer, but actually it is any integer that is 0 or larger based on the testing so far. Okay, so valid is any integer larger than 0, so the boundary is between -1 and 0. Now let's continue testing and let's see if we can find the upper boundary. Okay, entering another test case, title, let's say the year would be 2100. Let's see if this works. Seems to be working very well. I'm not going to check whether it actually went there. Outlook informed me that it was created, so I assumed it did work. So okay, let's try 10,000. So this is the 7th of January in the year 10,000. Let's see that it works. Interesting. No, created it here. Didn't work. Okay, so we can see that there is a pattern. It didn't go to the year 10,000. Although the system informed me it was created, it fixed the date this 7th. So now we still don't know the boundary. We know that 2100 works because it didn't come this week, so we assume that that's in a year 2100. Now let's just check that really quick. And so we have arrived to the January of 2100. Yes, we do. On the 7th there is an event. Okay, back to our testing documentation. So I'm not going to search for what would be the value that actually works. So we know that valid boundaries are 0 and then between some question marks. We know 2100 is okay. We know that 10,000 is not okay. And then to find the boundary where it actually cuts off would simply take too much time. So I'm just going to leave it at that. If some of you wish to find out where is the upper boundary, please go ahead and do it. Perhaps you can report the results in the question answer forum that we have for the group. Okay, I can state that there would be 1 extra point if you manage to find out the upper boundary of this Outlook web calendar. You can use any method you like to search for this upper boundary. Maybe you can even Google it. I don't know. But there would be 1 extra point for the one that reports it first in the group. Excuse me, not in the group, but in the question answer forum that we have it for this year 2020. One could also point out that maybe some of my test cases are not very reasonable. Testing the normal cases here with the month and the date would be reasonable, I think. Also more extensive testing for the leap year should be done. When it comes to years, finding negative years, year 10,000, yes, they might not be reasonable for the average user. But whether test cases are reasonable or not really depends on the use case. And we don't know all the possible use cases of this calendar application. Maybe there is a fiction writer that wants to write like historical story, and one needs to know the dates in the history to create like a historical timeline when certain person was born and when did the person die, for example, and then you would need to know the weekdays and so on. So you might create like a historical calendar for purposes of your fiction writing. And of course the same goes in for the future as well. So this is really use case dependent, and we can see that it works on values values that are greater or equal to 0. So there is possibility to create like a historical events. It's also possible to create events way into the future. 2100 was working, but 10,000 was not. Okay, so this was a video covering boundary values and equivalence classes in testing. As you can notice from the Outlook calendar example, testing is a lot of work. Already we come up with a lot of different test cases. We didn't even execute the months that had less than 31 days. We didn't cover the leap years. And we only covered the date functionality with entering numbers through the keyboard. So one in realistic settings should test it also through the calendar and so on.